Just a quick survey. How many of you are from software or technology companies? It's good to know. All right. One of the things that's been really interesting to me this week has been, I've always worked in technology, I've always worked in software companies. And the way we talk about Agile, the way we talk about Lean, all comes from the same stuff, same source material, but we talk about it in totally different ways than those who work in other industries. And so it's been a great education for me this week, kind of getting to understand that a little bit. So I'm talking about Agile Business Transformation, which is a pretty generic title. But why do I like to talk about Agile? I mean, there's things that are great about Agile that I learned doing software. And then as I've kind of moved up into executive roles, I found, oh, you know what, these things that we did to make software easier to write actually have broader business implications and can help businesses work better. So a lot of these things should be fairly uncontroversial. We all want to bring value to our customers more quickly. We want to adjust to market changes. We want to deliver faster. The last bullet, we all like the idea of having more innovation, but what I realized talking to people this week, especially those coming from more Six Sigma type backgrounds than I have, I don't have that background, is this last bullet. So we take a lot of the same ideas, we take a lot of the same tools, we just maximize, we're trying to maximize different things. In my world, innovation is more critical than efficiency, much more critical. I will happily trade efficiency for innovation. I will happily trade consistency for innovation. Now that's different than if I was manufacturing cars. In that world, I don't want people on the line inventing new car parts while the line's going. But in my world, I want everybody inventing new things all the time. So we have these kind of similar backgrounds, we have these similar ways of, we come from these similar worlds. We all are influenced by Agile software development, whether you use all these ideas or not. TPS has been super influential in the Agile software community, especially Kaizen and some of these other ideas. Where I think we start to diverge, I haven't heard anybody reference Lean Startup yet this week. Lean Startup in software, it's taking a lot of the ideas from TPS, but it's applying them in a very different way. It's really focused on innovation as a way of finding good product market fit and developing new products. The critical things for this one are validated learning to me and creating build, measure, learn loops. And in my world, all my efficiency is driven on making those build, measure, learn loops go faster by actually delivering product to customer as quickly as possible and getting their feedback. So from all these ideas, these are the tenets that I've developed, kind of transforming groups to be more innovative or just work faster at companies like Microsoft, Adobe, Spotify, and now Avo. And these are the things I talk about when I consult to other companies or meet with other companies as well. The first one, for those of you who are not from software, but you've heard Priya talk about it, and Zach, minimizing process. So this will be the most controversial thing I probably say today. You've heard from Priya, you heard from Zach that software developers hate process. Yeah, we kind of do. We acknowledge that process is necessary. Some processes are absolutely necessary. What we don't like, and I speak as a software developer, we don't like unnecessary process. So my question is always, well, because I tend to think about processes as a way of making teams that have strict dependencies between each other, deliver to each other in ways that they can work together. And if you're doing that, if you have these strong dependencies between teams, you start to get something that, if you're in computer systems, you know is Amdahl's law, which is that the speed of the system is constrained to the speed of the slowest part of the system. That's your bottleneck. And I want to remove bottlenecks wherever I can. Process can be a bottleneck if you have too much of it. So we need some process, but we always need a little bit. I always would rather have a little, too little process and kind of deal with the implications of that than have too much and slow the system down. Team autonomy is something super important. and has become increasingly important in software. If you're familiar with Spotify, that's a huge part of what Spotify credits to its organizational agility. It's the idea that we, as I said, if there are strict dependencies between teams, you have these team collaboration bottlenecks, these team coordination bottlenecks, you're synchronizing backlogs, you're synchronizing deliveries, you're making requests to one another. If you can empower teams with the resources they need to achieve their missions, and you craft their missions so that their missions aren't overlapping, you reduce the number of strict dependencies between teams, which means that each of those teams can go at the fastest rate it possibly can. And in my world, because teams can deliver independent of each other, that's great. I can have a team delivering 5 times a day and another team delivering once a week. And that's a good thing in my world, because they're each going at the speed that makes most sense for that group of people. I've managed a zillion teams over my career. I've never had 2 teams work exactly the same way or have the same natural cadence, because they're all made up of people. So by giving teams autonomy, I let them work at their natural cadences. Part of this as well is moving decision-making down to the lowest possible place in the organization. This may or may not be controversial, depending on your world. The idea is that this is now another bottleneck. It's a decision-making bottleneck. If I had to approve every decision of note as the CTO, and I'm here, that means no decisions are getting made while I'm here. So either I have to be here working the whole time and not getting to attend the conference, or I never get to go to conferences. And I like going to conferences, so I don't want to do that. So instead, what I spend my time doing is giving my organization the business context, the industry context, any kind of information I have, so that they can marry that with their local problems that they're trying to solve. Theoretically, if I've hired people smarter than I am, and that's not too hard, those people will make better decisions than I am. Now, if, especially if you come from a more kind of traditional background, this is where you'd say, well, yeah, but what about accountability? You have all these teams doing their own things. They have very little processes that provide governance and consistency, and then you're letting them make their own decisions. Like, how is this not, 1,000 teams going in 1,000 directions? I'll talk about alignment in a minute, but part of this is the idea that in order to make this work, you have to have a data-driven culture, and that's on 2 sides. One is building a culture that understands about making data-driven decisions. I don't like opinion-based decisions, I like data-driven decisions. If people are making decisions using real data, I can trust a little bit more that they're making good decisions. But on the other side, each of these autonomous teams has real business KPIs that they uniquely own. And that provides a very strict accountability for them and for me. If those metrics are moving in the right direction, they are doing their job. If those metrics are not moving in the right direction, then there's a problem. And so that's very clear and it's well understood. Another way is that, as we said, I like to deliver value to customers as quickly as possible. We all do. The great thing about software is, as I said, I can do that 5 times in a day. I can do that 10 times in a day. I can do that as often as I want. That's a nice thing. It's a little hard to do that with cars. And I understand that. But also, if we can make that build, measure, learn loop faster, if we can get things to our customers faster, the mistakes that we make, and we will make mistakes because we're innovating, right? We're going to make mistakes all over the place, but we make small mistakes instead of big mistakes. Back when I was working at Microsoft on a Windows team, we'd spend 2 years writing a piece of software, and it wouldn't see a customer until those disks hit their computers. So that's how things like Bob, Microsoft Bob, for those of you who remember it, that's how Clippy came out, right? Because nobody saw it until, that was years of development to build Clippy. Managing WIP, this should be totally uncontroversial. We all like to manage WIP. Again, it's about focus, like the last talk. Complexity, reducing the amount of complexity, Stephen's talk. I've seen repeatedly, you have 100 engineers working, or let me call them developers, because I know a lot of real engineers at the conference. You have 100 developers working, and the leadership team says, oh, we should be able to do at least 50 things. We have 100 developers, except they forget about all the other things that people do as part of their job. So when you have you try and do 50 things, you really end up doing 200 things, and all the developers are constantly context switching, and people are constantly complaining that nothing's getting done, everything's super slow. And what they haven't realized is that we're asking people to do more than they can. So by tightly managing WIP, we tend to go much, much faster. We all talk about this all the time. I'm not going to spend any time on this. So about 9 months ago, I came to Avo. I came from Sweden, from Spotify. And Avo is sort of an interesting case study. It's a company that's been around 10 years, actually same amount of time as Spotify. It had a very long time of linear growth. It's growing nicely year over year. And then a few years ago, it hit this great product market fit inflection point, and all of a sudden growth really, really took off. And of course, the company, seeing the opportunity, decided to invest in the growth. The company grew much, much faster, and all of a sudden, all the processes, all the ways of working that had worked for years, all of a sudden stopped working, because now there was way more people, and you couldn't rely on. We went from being in, they went from being in one floor, one big room, to now it's spread over 7 floors of the office building. And so it was, so one of the reasons they brought me in was to help them kind of figure out how to get back to much, much more efficient, much faster ways of working. I'm going to talk about 3 programs that we've put in place that are aligned to these tenets that I've discussed. So Dubs, WIGS, and Journey teams. First off is Dubs. Dubs is a data-driven decision-making framework. So it's something that we created to make making data-driven decisions super, super easy and really accessible to the whole organization, Dubs is an anagram? Yes. Is that the right word? I'm an engineer. I didn't take an English class in college. It stands for data, understandings, hypotheses, bets, and then there's a silent R there for results. It's a silent R because we're based in Seattle, and so that's what UW is. Not because we don't care about results, we do. It comes from a few places. So when I was at Spotify, we had something called DIBS, which is actually very similar. There were some things I had, and actually if you want to Google Spotify DIBS, somebody's given a talk about it. You can find some slides on it. But there were some issues that I had with DIBS that we tried to address. We took those, we added in some ideas from Kaizen cards and the Toyota A3 problem-solving framework to create this model. So if you think of a page going top to bottom, each section kind of flows from the last. We start with data. We always start with data. That data, and this at first in the organization was the thing that kind of freaks people out, is where do I get this data? And just teaching people there's data all around you. There's data within the company, there's industry data, there's people you know at other companies that you can tap to find out how they do things. The point is you want to start with facts. We always start with facts. The elements in your data should be incontrovertible. And usually because you have a strategy, you're outlining your decision, they should also not be cherry-picked. That's what we tend to pick apart when we see a poorly written dub. From your data comes your understanding, your analysis of the data, right? Given the state of the world, this is what we see. This is what we think about the state of the world. From there comes the hypotheses. Now this is where we move into strategy. So understanding your analysis should be semi-incontrovertible. Now we're very much in the realm of subjective. Given the state of the world, our understanding of the state of the world, this is what we should do about it as a company. And then finally is the bets, and the bets are the tactics that we are using to validate or invalidate the hypotheses. And so when the bets are run, either sequentially or parallel, depending on how they're authored, we should either validate or invalidate the hypotheses, which either means our understandings were incorrect, we missed some of the data, or this is correct strategy and we should continue to move this way. We capture the results in the document. That document becomes part of our archive. It becomes data for future dubs. So we taught the entire company how to do this. We don't require anybody to use it because of autonomy. There are very narrow things we actually do require it for. But mostly we just taught people how to do it. And we were amazingly gratified to find out that people really liked it, actually, and started to use it. And it has become very common at AVO that you say, hey, we should do this, and some random person says, oh, you write a dub on that, and I'd really like to see it. So that's kind of been the way we started communicating ideas. WIGS and SWIGS. How many of you know Franklin Covey's 4 Disciplines of Execution? Oh, okay. That's kind of where this is. We kind of did our own spin on it. Definitely comes from that. WIGS for you is another, stands for Wildly Important Goals. The way we've instituted this at AVO, because we had a big problem. There was priorities were not communicated well, and that led to people blowing out WIP all over the place, because people like me, the senior leadership team, would just drop in on the team and say, hey, it'd be awesome if you do this, and all of a sudden that was some unplanned work. That was happening all the time. So saw that as a problem. So what we're going to do is be very, very clear. These are the priorities for the company. We set these once a year. My peers and I, we meet in the fall like you normally do for your company strategy. We figure out what we think the WIGS should be. We run them by the board in the Q4 board meeting and then introduce them to the company. These are very strictly WIP limited. Last year, we kind of started this mid-year because that's when I joined. We did 4, that was too many. This year we're doing 2, that's probably too few. We'll see if we come up with a different number next year. From there, if you know WIGS and PIGS, PIGS being pretty important goals, we instead called them sub-WIGS because for some reason we didn't like PIGS. These projects are tactical. So if WIGS are priorities for the company for the year, these are scoped to we try and scope them to be a quarter. We're still getting good at that, so they tend to slip into 2 quarters. The important part is the cadences that they're reviewed every 6 weeks. At that point, we can replace one, we can remove one, we can add a new one if we have organizational capability to do that. We try and keep them very strictly WIP limited. There are currently 4. Last year we tried 7. We accomplished 4, so we're going to do 4 now. Currently we're doing 3 because we just finished one. And we're deciding whether we add a 4th back or not. These are actually, the way we do this is the senior leadership team, we communicate the WIGS for the company, the priorities for the year, and then we source from the organization dubs that are proposed tactics to align to those WIGS. The sub-WIGS end up being tranches, essentially, of dubs sourced from the organization. So as a member of the senior leadership team, we set the priorities, the global, the high order priorities for the company, and then we source from the teams, which is actually well aligned to the 4 disciplines of execution. We source the tactics from the organization itself. So this is the one place we require dubs, because dubs document the tactics. One thing I'll say, the sub-WIGS specifically are scoped to be cross-team projects. And you'll understand why these are cross-team projects when I talk about journey teams. So journey teams, if you remember the tenants I had, we didn't have these kind of teams before. We had what I would call cross-functional software teams, which meant that we had little teams that had designers, developers, and testers on them, kind of like the Spotify squads if you've read this paper. One of the deficiencies that we had at Spotify with that model was the other functions actually worked completely differently. They were all siloed. And that was a problem, because if you were in finance at Spotify, it was like you were finance at a bank. It was no different than any other company, which meant that there was always problems when these 2 groups would interact. So one of the things we did is, with these teams, thank you, these are based on customer journeys. You've heard a lot of people talk about customer journeys. That is the genesis of these teams. That is what these teams are organized, both internal and external teams. So for example, we have a finance journey team that actually has members of finance in it. So it's not a bunch of developers that talk to people in finance once in a while. No, it's finance people, developers, data analysts, engineers, all working together. And that's unusual in a lot of companies. But that means that the customer is actually part of the team. So the people that are solving problems for the company are all together. In the software teams, that includes marketing. Consumer marketing is part of the team that actually does the work. Now that may sound similar for your larger organizations to like a division, except the size of this team is more on the 20 to 25 person size. So these teams are actually extremely nimble and able to change on a dime, but they're rarely really as close as possible to the customer. They each own unique business metrics that they drive, and that is their primary accountability, and that has become our primary unit of organizational execution. I'm out of time, just real quickly, so these are the goals we built. What I'll say is that these 3 programs combined have actually, in just 9 months at Avo, have rapidly enabled our ability to innovate, deliver faster. It's actually working quite well, solving the problems that we had. So if you go back to those tenets, you think if those make sense to you, if you apply them in your own business context, your own business culture, those are actually, I can say for a fact, I've seen this at multiple companies, those can work for you. All right, and take questions out of the panel. Thank you.